I'll just be a little blunt and say that, quite frankly, since Richard Holbrooke's death, unfortunate death, I think the US has just taken its eye off the ball as far as Afghanistan is concerned. President Obama has been obsessed with this withdrawal, and he wants, this legacy of before he steps down, to have removed all US troops from the Middle East and Afghanistan. And of course, the circumstances of what's going on in the world today is not going to allow that to happen. And I think the lack of first of all, the lack of military involvement is one thing, but even more, we have an Afghan army now trying to fight the Taliban without any air power, or with very minimal air power. The US provides only air power when its own troops or special forces are on the ground. And that's an insult to the Afghans. After, you've trained this whole army, 350,000 men and soldiers and all the rest of it, and then you leave them without any air power to meet with the Taliban. And, I think that's totally disgraceful and very humiliating for the army itself. The other part of this is that the whole diplomatic initiative to, encourage Pakistan to get talks moving between the Afghan Taliban and the Kabul government to help stabilize the Afghan government, I think, a lot of that has been left at a very low level within the American establishment. And we have not seen the kind of diplomatic pressure really being put on the Afghan government to get its act together, to get the talks going, etc. So I just hope that, that there's going to be a sort of rebound, given the situation in the world, that President Obama will be taking in the next few months some greater interest. Now that the Americans have committed 5,000 troops, and they know that this coming summer is critical, because if real cities and towns and territories lost to the Taliban, then Afghanistan is lost, quite frankly. So I think it's absolutely critical that, the Obama administration take greater interest in Afghanistan than they have done.
Barney, do you think that they will? And what would be an optimal policy from your point of view?
Well, I think they're rightly putting emphasis on an attempt to bring at least part of the Taliban into the fold through a process of a peace process, or a process of political settlement. It would, of course, everything Ahmed says would be desirable. I could tell you all the reasons that they're not giving air power, they haven't given air power to the Afghan army. But among them is the things that you mentioned about the government, which is that the government is not functioning really at the moment, or unfortunately. And is, there's just been a very blistering report about the management of the security forces written by some of the regime's own loyalists. And Afghanistan just has certain structural problems that can't be solved by pressure. That is to say, it doesn't have the resources to pay for the state by itself. And the international community has only had, and this, I suppose we agree on this, has had a very narrow interest in Afghanistan, a kind of narrow definition of counterterrorism, and has demanded things of the Afghan government that no Afghan government could possibly supply, given just the nature of the country. So I think actually bigger than the threat than the Taliban is, there's some donor conferences coming up, and if the countries are so dissatisfied with and this is not just the United States, but the United States, European countries, and so on. If they are so dissatisfied with the performance of the Afghan government, which it's extremely easy to be dissatisfied with the performance of the Afghan government, and everyone in Afghanistan is, and that's why there are 10,000s of people trying to get out of the country, then they may decide to decrease seriously the amount of money that they are giving, which of course creates, what is called negative feedback in systems theory. That is, which will make the situation worse. I think that's it's short-sighted, but given the nature of the way the system works, it's probably inevitable. And that's why I think it's important to put, we've reached the limit. I think we agreed on this before in 2008, before we wrote that article together in Foreign Affairs called From Great Game to Grand Bargain. I think we've reached the limit of what we can accomplish with more money and more troops. Unfortunately, we neglected the political aspect. I was working for Richard Holbrooke, of course, and we tried to make that more prominent. And I think that is necessary more than ever, because more money, more troops are not going to solve the problems.